Before I begin the actual teaching on 1 Kings chapter 3, I came across this quote by Augustine that I think was extremely insightful. I wanted to share it with you. The same suffering will be confirmation, baptism, and purification to the virtuous man, but to the evildoer it will be a curse, calamity, and ruin. Now that's an intriguingly powerful insight, and I've not quite seen it that way. That we all will suffer. No one gets out of here alive without suffering, you see. We're all going to go through adversity. The question is whether the suffering will transform us or actually make us bitter at the end of the day and lead to curse, calamity, and ruin. And again, we've known this before about suffering, whether it'll make you either bitter or better, depending on your response to it. So your response, it's not what happens to you, but how you respond to what happens. Again, you're not defined by your circumstances, but what you do in response to the circumstances. And the response to the circumstances will be contingent on your view of God regarding your circumstances. And if He's in control, then you have to believe that you must view your circumstances, and I've often put it this way, in light of God's unchanging character, because if you don't, you'll regard God's character in light of your changing circumstances. Does that make sense to you? And a lot of people do this. They're on a roller coaster spiritually, so that when things are going well, they have no problem with thanking and praising God. But what happens when they do not? Their view of God's character somehow changes, but their failure to grasp that God's character never changes. He's immutable. Your circumstances do, but He's even going to use that and redeem that in a way that makes sense. So this is why Augustine says for the believer, it would be confirmation, baptism, and purification, that there is a kind of a movement from that. And so what we see here in all the characters in the scriptures, we see this concept of what that looks like in our life journey. Now, there's something that's very significant that I want to call your attention to, and it's in Deuteronomy chapter 17, before I get to our text about Solomon. So if we turn to Deuteronomy 17, I've pointed this out before to you, but it's worth a revisit, particularly when you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it. Now, this is Moses now. Remember, Moses near the end of his life, and he is predicting 400 years in advance what will take place. 400 years in advance, because you see, there will be a period of the judges that will occur, and it would last for a significant time. But ultimately, it would go from basically a theocracy to a monarchy. Because give us a king like everybody else. We want a visible king. We don't want an invisible king. And remember when Samuel says, the Lord your God was your king, and yet He's allowing you to do this. And indeed, it was predicted. This is not a surprise to God. This is a very important thing for us to realize. The old phrase, we don't know what the future holds, but we know who holds the future. And that's a very important distinction, because if He holds the future, here's an example of prophetic prophecy where it was in fact fulfilled, and it was not a surprise to God. He knew the people would rebel against Him, but this is all part of the story, part of the journey. And so He then says, I'll set a king, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations around me. See, this is again exactly what they clamored for, just like everyone else. He says, but then He gives instructions for this king that they would choose. You will surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your own countrymen. You'll set as a king over yourself, not a foreigner. And furthermore, He's not going to multiply horses for Himself, nor shall He cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord said, you'll never again return that way. He shall not multiply wives for Himself, or else His heart will turn away, nor shall He greatly increase silver and gold for Himself. Now, what you have there is a symbol of power. And so when you're thinking about horses, of course, you're thinking about don't multiply horses, and they correspond, of course, to something that is not neutral at all. So all of these things are powerful pulls, you see. And what you have is the horses corresponding to power, because that's what they really were used as. It was an indicator of power, sex, and money. Our usual sequence: money, sex, and power. Same things. People haven't changed a whit. Human nature has changed a lot, but people haven't changed a whit because they're all bearers of the image of God. The circumstances change. So here's the three things that we're not supposed to do. From what I can see, almost all the kings were really good at multiplying those three things. But the man who exceeded them all was Solomon. There's nobody. Again, Solomon's philosophy was, if a little is good, more is better, and too much is just right. That was his mindset, you see. So here's a man who multiplied wives. Remember the 300 wives and 700 porcupines, I always like to say, the concubines. But what are you going to do? Think about you got a harem of that nature. You see, even if you make it down, let's just be conservative, make it 100. It's still a radical absurdity. You can't, it would take a great deal. I'd let you process the energy involved in this. And the time and energy and the dissipation, you don't even need to go there. The man liked to make covenants with other nations, and that's why he married these foreign wives, because he was solidifying covenants, and it's the way you would do it. But again, it was in violation of the mandate of Torah. As far as horses, he had massive numbers of horses, and it describes his stables that were huge, 40,000, huge numbers of horses. And then third, he had greater amounts of silver and gold than anyone ever had. It was just absolutely astonishing. But then there were two other things that they were supposed to do. So they were pretty good about violating the one, but the two things they were supposed to do, from what I can tell, not a one of them ever did, which is an amazing thought. Even King David, from what I know, didn't do it. That is to say, when he sits in the throne of his kingdom, he'll write for himself a copy of this law. And he's talking about, of course, what would later be called the Torah, the Mosaic Law, the Pentateuch, the 5 books. And on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priest. So this is a very amazing thought. He was to be a man, you see, in the presence of the Levitical priest, because he was to be a man of the word, and he had to be a man under authority, accountability. That's why he did it in the presence of the Levitical priest, going back to our material here. And here's the reason for it. It will be with him, and he shall read it all. It's in his own writing. And he's going to take this. What's he going to do with this? He's going to read it all the days of his life, every day, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by carefully observing all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left, so that he and his sons may continue long in his kingdom in the midst of Israel. So what was part of the point of it? For him to walk with humility before God and to have a proper sense of proportion, that God is the one who sovereignly appointed you and called you to this position. Don't suppose that you achieved this. And so it was designed then to give him this idea of fearing the Lord, observing the words of this law, heart not being lifted above his countrymen, and staying with the commandments of God. So he is to be a man of the word and a man of authority. As I say, not a person ever did it. It's an intriguing exercise to imagine what would it be like if you took the New Testament, for example, and wrote it out in your own handwriting. Interesting thought. Some have done this, and it's in their own journal. I remember back when I was first in Knoxville, and I had a journal, I still have it, where I would actually write down the passages I wanted to memorize. I learned a lot of scripture in those days. I remember doing Romans, and I had this column here, and I don't know why I did in 2 columns, but it was in my own handwriting, and that's what I memorized. You see, it was something about that was very powerful for me to learn it that way rather than just out of the text. So I don't know, it was an intuition that I had, but it served me very well, and thus I did with other books as well. And so to be a man of the word and be a man under authority. So this contextualizes the material we're looking at, because when we go to our text in 1 Kings chapter 3, what we'll see is that now that Solomon has established his throne, he forms a marriage alliance, though, with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and this is one of many. And he brought her to the city of David. Now, this is probably his preeminent alliance. And so he actually built her a house. And until he had finished building his own house, he brought her to the city of David, which would, of course, be Jerusalem. The people were still sacrificing it, and the wall around, you see, and the wall around Jerusalem. So he built that and the wall. The people were still sacrificing on the high places because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. And so one of the high places was Gibeah, as we're going to see. And so he goes down to, he has this dream, and he is in Gibeon, and the Lord appears to him. But you see, they were going to these high places, and there was sadly, there was a kind of like an eclectic religion, a little bit of those syncretism, where you take a little of this and a little of that, which is precisely what people are doing, designer religions, designer worldviews, basically a little of this, a little of that. So I'll have a little of Zen, and I'll throw in a little astrology, a little New Age, a little this, and you formulate your own cocktail, of a cognitive cocktail. And it's your own drink that you've mixed. And then you can always change it and throw this thing in and throw that in there. And it's amazing how people they're not tethered to anything substantive, but they'll believe almost anything. Because you see, when people stop believing in God, it's not that they believe in nothing, they believe in anything. You see what I'm saying? They become gullible. They believe the stupidest things. And we'll stop and think about it. You go outside and look at any tree, any leaf, any plant, and you tell me that that's something that was by chance. I mean, it's intuitively obvious. And the science is increasingly demonstrable. But my point is that Solomon, though, the amazing thing is how he puts up with this nonsense. You see? In spite of this, he still blesses the man. In spite of the fact that right away, right from the get-go, he's disobeyed the scriptures. He married a foreigner. He was not supposed to do it. It was supposed to be from your own tribes. And so he does this and creates this marriage alliance, and so first of many, or one of many. Now Solomon loved the Lord, though, and this is the interesting tension here. So he loved the Lord, and he walked in the statutes of his father, except he sacrificed and burned sins, except for that. Pretty good, except for that, a little minor, little thing like that. It's kind of, it seems like a minor thing, but it's not a minor thing. Except that he was an idolater. But yet he loved God, you see. So again, may I tell you how gracious God is to us. He gives us far better than we deserve, and he knows our hearts are not pure, and it's not complete. But still, there was something about Solomon that at this time he still loved the Lord, and this dream revealed it. So he went to Gibeon to sacrifice for there because it was a great high place. And so when we think about the of Gibeon, Gibeon was west of Jerusalem, and so it was Jerusalem would be over to the right there, but it was in this area, and that's where the tabernacle still was. So that's why it would be a legitimate place to go, because of the tabernacle worship. And so he went to Gibeon to sacrifice, and he offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. Whatever Solomon did, he did it in spades. You see, he did it in great abundance, didn't he? It was just incredible. If a little was good, again, you get the message here. But he did love the Lord, and again, Gibeon is where the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night. And he said, and ask what you wish me to give you. And then we have this prayer. Now, it's an interesting thing, this thing in a dream. But apparently, because you're dealing with the unconscious, and I was just trying this morning to remember my crazy dreams, and they were so symbolic I couldn't grasp the content. But they were really interesting. I wish I could get it. But my conscious mind isn't as smart as my unconscious mind. So as I wake up, I get dumber and dumber, basically. But it's amazing. But here's a vivid dream in which it's kind of like almost like a dream/vision, but ask what you wish me to give you. Now, this is an intriguing question because we have to ask this question here. These are 3 of Jesus' most important questions that he'd ever asked. And the first question is a kicker, because what you seek will define what you find. It'll define you. You become conformed by that to which you aspire, as I like to put it. And what it means then is You're looking for something. You may not even consciously know it, but you're seeking something. And if it's not the living God, it'll be something that's not worthy of you, because you were only meant to serve the trans-finite and the trans-temporal. What do you seek? And of course, that's what Jesus asked in John 1:38. And that will determine what you find. And then the second great question of Jesus, and again, he asked many questions. I've seen different lists. One book has 307, another one has 135. Depends on how you define the questions. But surely he asked a lot of questions and answered very few. Because when he answered a question, it was with a question. So who do you say I am, though? This was at Caesarea Philippi. And others say this, others say that, but what do you say? And then when Peter says, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God, you see, flesh and blood didn't reveal this to me, but my Father in heaven revealed this to you, because this is something that he has basically hidden his identity until the right time, until the hour has come. So this is secondly, and every person will have to answer this question, whether in this life or in the next. Every tongue will confess and every knee will bow and acknowledge. They'll know who he is, but then it'll be too late. You see, you've got to bow the 2 times. Everyone will bow the knee then, but not everyone bows the knee in this life. And it's the one who bows the knee in this life who then has eternal life, you see, and he's acknowledged who he is, and he has no other option. I can't go anywhere else. Even though I don't understand where you're taking me, you have words of eternal life. And then the third question is basically his last question. So you have the first and his last question. Do you love me more than these? And he's, of course, speaking to Peter. And the these, does it mean the disciples? Does it mean the fish? Does it mean the things in this world? But the point is, what do you love more than anything else is what he's asking for him to pursue. Now, Solomon, again, we go back to the text and we see that he had a genuine love for God. And this becomes evident in his dream. And Solomon's response in this dream is, you have shown great loving kindness to your servant David, my father, according as he walked before you in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart toward you. And you've reserved for him this great loving kindness, that you've given him a son to sit on his throne as it is to this day. Oh, by the way, I'm that son. You've given him a son. Oh, yeah, I'm that son. So he sees he's part of this divine legacy, and he doesn't take it with the light hand. Because he said, this is a great gift. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. Yet I am but a little child. So this is the wisdom that he has, that he recognizes how little he knows. I do not know how to go out or come in. Your servant is in the midst of your people, which you have chosen, a great people who are too many to be numbered or counted. So give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? That's an incredible statement. And God was pleased with this. Again, it's all taking place in a dream. And so you would have thought if it was in his conscious mind, but apparently it's revealing his heart. And ultimately, he reveals his true heart by saying at this juncture that he knows he's not able to actually accomplish this. It's too big for him. This task you've given me is only something that you can carry. But he's effectively asking God to give him this grand gift of discerning good and evil, having wisdom and prudence and understanding. And it was pleasing in the sight of the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. God said to him, because you've asked this thing and have not asked for yourself a long life, nor asked riches for yourself, nor have you asked for the life of your enemies. Note those 3 things, you see. One would be very tempted to ask for the wrong things. And this is why whenever you read about stories about the genie, sometimes granting 3 wishes, sometimes 4, depends on what they are, they always blow it. You know, it's always this way, you know. So there's 3 men on a desert island, and there's a bottle that washes up on the shore, and one of them pops up and opens. Sure enough, a genie does pop out, and he says, I'm going to give each of you 1 wish. So the first one says, man, that sounds great to me. I want to go and be home and get off this island, be back home. And poof, he disappears. The bottle drops in the sand. The next one sees it. He goes and offers the same wish. He too disappears. The third one's not as bright. He goes up to the bottle and says, I'm lonely. I want my 2 friends back. We always blow it with our dreams. Have you noticed this? Always blow it with a dream, with our wishes. So, God, because you've asked this thing, what does he say? You haven't asked for secondary goods. I'll even give you the secondary, which is a fundamental biblical principle. Seek the first things first. He throws the secondary things in for the bargain. Seek, again, and I've said this so many times, but seek security, significance, satisfaction. Seek love, joy, and peace, even as ends in themselves. You'll never find them. You'll only find those things as the overflow of the pursuit of God above all else. Seek him first. I'll throw in the rest. You see, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and everything is thrown in. So he says, you haven't asked for these. I've done according to your words. Behold, I've given you a wise and discerning heart. So there's been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you. The only exception to that would, of course, be the one who is the wellspring of all wisdom. It would be Yeshua HaMashiach. But apart from him, Solomon was apparently the wisest of men. And yet, how did he become the foolish man that he became? How did he become so foolish that he gave his heart away and allowed it to be dissipated with idolatry because of his compromise? And so it's a mystery to me. How can the wisest man who has enough wisdom become a fool in his old age? And so you wonder, what foundation was that wisdom built upon? You see, it apparently wasn't thick enough. It was an initial intention, but he didn't apparently follow the disciplines, the training necessary to habituate it, to send those roots more deeply into the soil of his soul. And it seems to me that the interior life is critical, because everything comes out of your life, out of your interior life. And so if you're not cultivating that interior life, you too can, even if you have a natural proclivity toward wisdom, it can be diminished, it seems to me. But here's the principle here. I've also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there will not be any among the kings like you all your days. If you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and commandments as your father David walked, then I will prolong your days. So he's giving him all the things that he didn't ask for. And this amazing thought. Again, seek the first things first, the second things are thrown in. Seek the second things first, you miss out on not only on the second things, but the first as well. You miss out on the first and the second. Seek heaven first, your earth is thrown in. Seek earth first, and you not only miss out on heaven, but you miss out on the true joys of earth. You see what I'm saying with that? And so it's a matter of the first and second things, your priorities. So, but again, he urges him, if you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and commandments. Already he's violated the statutes and commandments by even this foreign alliance. And yet, God, in his grace, manages, he stoops to conquer in a way, and he gives us far more than our desert. And then Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. He came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. Remember then, the tabernacle was in Gibeon, and that's where he was. It was about 5 miles west of Jerusalem, but the ark had been brought by David, remember, into the city of David. So that was another place where that we could offer sacrifices, of course. And so he stood before the Ark of the Covenant and offered burnt offerings, made peace offerings, made a feast for all his servants. And so he wisely judges. And then we go into this material about an illustration of his legendary wisdom, that people would come, including the Queen of Sheba. And the great chapter in this book will be in chapter 10, when he has this visit by her. And this incredible thing takes place, where 2 women who were harlots, and it's noteworthy to see that, because even they were granted, though, the dignity of being adjudicated before the king, and there was a condition where there was no witnesses. And so it was a kingly decision that was necessary for this, because there was a good deal of latitude even here, because of the issue of livelihood. And if they were widows, often they would be in that condition like that. So they're in a position where it's very difficult for a woman to make provision for herself in that culture. But at any rate, so there is some latitude for that in spite of that. But the one woman said, "Oh, my Lord, this woman and I live in the same house. I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. It happened on the 3rd day that after I gave birth, that this woman also gave birth to a child, and we were together. There was no stranger with us in the house, only the two of us in the house. So there's no witness beyond themselves, their own testimony. This woman's son died in the night because she lay on it. So she arose in the middle of the night and took my son from beside me while your maidservant slept, and laid him in her bosom, and laid her dead son in my bosom. When I rose in the morning to nurse my son, behold, he was dead. She knew her son. But when I looked at him carefully in the morning, behold, it was not my son whom I had born. Then the other woman said, no, for the living one is my son, and the dead one is your son. But the first woman said, no, for the dead one is your son, and the living one is my son. Thus they spoke before the king. So that's definitely a conundrum. You've got one word against another, and there's no witness. So what kind of wisdom would you use? And this was a magisterial moment in his life. The king said, the one says, this is my son who is living, and your son is the dead one. The other says, no, for your son is the dead one, and my son is the living one. The king said, get me a sword. This is not what they expected to see. So they brought a sword before the king. The king said, divide the living child in two and give half to the one and half to the other. Now this is incredible. It's like a gambit that he's playing here. And give half to the one. Then the woman whose child was the living one spoke to the king, for she was deeply stirred over her son. Because you can see as he's about to strike, she intercedes. And she said, oh my Lord, give her the living child and by no means kill him. The other said, he shall be neither mine nor yours, divide him. Then the king said, give the first woman the living child and by no means kill him. She is his mother. When all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had handed down, they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. So it's a great vignette, isn't it? It does amplify, though, the incredible wisdom that he had. And the fear of God is one of the major themes that you see in this whole motif. That as long as one walks in the fear of God and that sense of the dread of God, and yet at the same time the love of God. And remember, I've shown you this before when I've talked about the attributes of God, where I talk about you need both fear and trust. You need to have God is holy, transcendent, awesome, beyond our imagination. Who will not then tremble before him? But it is not a fear of punishment, but rather a fear of the divine displeasure. Because remember what I've said before, and this is very important in this time. What do you fear the most? You will have a supreme fear object. You can't help it. You have a fear object. The question is that object worthy of fear? In other words, it will really relate to what do you fear losing the most, probably, you see? Will you fear losing the accolades of the King of Kings, or the accolades of men, or any number of variations thereof? And so it becomes a very critical question then. What you fear will reveal what you love. There are two sides of the same coin. What you fear the most will reveal what you love the most. They're not inimical, these concepts. So when John says there's no fear in love because perfect love casts out fear, and there's no fear, and because he who then fears does not abide in that love. But he's not talking about that kind of fear that leads punishment. He's talking about, because there is no punishment, there's no condemnation in Christ Jesus. But this is not the kind of fear. We're talking about a trust as well. So it's a trusting, but you cannot understand him, and this is my point here. You will never understand his ways. You cannot possibly understand him, but you can trust him. But he's beyond your imagination. And he reveals only the thinnest part in comparison to what he could reveal. There's so many mysteries about him that I've told you before, a lot of mysteries about him. And I've added a bunch more. So that wasn't enough, I added more, because I don't know why the lists it missed stuff, you see. I don't know why it should, because why didn't it have love and rather mathematics? The mathematics of God, the play of God, the holiness of God, the mysteries of God, by which I mean there are boundless numbers of mysteries of which we know nothing at all, you see. And the farming of God. He's a farmer. The pleasure of God, the gardening, the infinitude, the architecture, the beauty, the light, the brilliance, So here is one that cannot be grasped or understood. He's beyond our imagination. But we need to fear the Lord our God with all our hearts and know him well. This reminds me as well, as sometimes people speak about Mary and Martha. And I've talked to you about this before, the contrast between these three lives. There's the active life, which was in the past centuries, especially during the Middle Ages, associated with what was the laity. So the laity would basically be doers, you see. And the religious would be the ones who were the beers, presumably. They're the ones who would have contemplative lives. Priests and monks, and among the monks, some were anchorites who were basically hermits, and others were cenobites who were in communities, you see. But at the end of the day, that was the mindset, the typical mindset. And I think that was really not a proper mindset. I think we should always seek the mixed life, where you are contemplative, but you're contemplative in action. So that you practice his presence, you carry him with you wherever you go. And this is where we have this idea. Now, I believe Jesus was a contemplative in action. He took his solitude with him wherever he went. Indeed, when we talk about the active and the contemplative life, we often think of Martha as an exemplar of the active and Mary of the contemplative. I want to be careful not to denigrate Martha. It's a mistake that people sometimes make when Jesus said she's taken the best part, and that will not be taken from her. But the point is this. Both parts are necessary. It's just that you start with the interior life and then go to the exterior. So the contemplative, the inner life, will animate the outer life, it seems. So in my view, then, you want to be, in this sense, both Mary and Martha. It wants to be being and doing, and the two sides of that coin are necessary, it seems to me, because you want to be a contemplative in action. You want to carry Christ with you wherever you go, and that becomes a matter of true wisdom as we embrace the fear of God. Again, going down to this idea I've given you many times, but you want to start from the interior life and let the interior life, the spiritual life, affect your moral character, which then enhances your relationships. And if you have that interior life, then that will be the stuff that sustains right relationships. And because you can become other-centered as you have that life of Christ. Remember, there are two other spheres, the theoretical and the functional. And we've said before that many times, though, people can be theoretical or functional successes and have excellence in those areas, but be very thin in the interior life. And that's why I often say that never try to accomplish, too many times we try to accomplish more in public action than we can cover in our interior growth. You see the concept then? The idea of Shabbat. And Leonard and I were talking about Sabbath a lot. And this whole idea of Sabbath, I recognize my desperate need for Shabbat, for Sabbath, for that contemplative dimension in my life. I also am seeking to make it more part of my ordinary practice. I'm practicing this whole thing, and Stuart, my friend, is practicing it with me now. We're trying to train ourselves so that more and more frequently we remember to shoot up three things when we pass through portals. Any door or any opening a door of a car. And it's an amazing thing. It's so hard to train myself to do this. But I did it a little bit this morning, but then forgot again after that. But after a while, I think if I keep on reminding myself when I do it, it'll be an incredible opportunity, because here's what I do every time. Trust the Father, abide in the Son, walk by the Spirit. That's it. I can shoot that up when I go through a door. How long does it take? And so it becomes a vehicle, a tool, a means by which we can practice more and more the interior life and practice his presence in the course of all things. So that you want to have, though, there are times that are formal times for being with him, and then there are informal times as well. But you want to bring him with you in the hubbub of daily life as well. So those are just some of the components here that we can see with Solomon that I think are very critical for us to understand a life where this king was a man of great wisdom. And then we'll see in the next chapter how he was king overall and his officials and the wisdom that they had. So in terms of the material that we were using together, we were using 1 Kings 3. So when we're together the next time, we're going to jump to chapter 8. So I'll have to fill in the other chapters. But in that chapter, this is when the Lord appears to him. In chapter 8, rather, it has to do with the building of the temple, the construction of the temple itself, which is a great glory and a great wonder. And so when we go to these chapters, then there's a lot of intervening material where it describes the order, the structure of his kingdom, and how, but it also describes his power and his wealth and his wisdom, and how Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. This was the zenith of Israel. This was what Israel was intended to be. You see, if you honor God, and it was the United Kingdom, you see, if you only do this, I will bless you and I will make you foremost among the nations. They will serve you. You won't be serving them. But if you disobey me, you will then be, in fact, at the least of others. And so it's all depending on your heart. This is what it was meant to be like, and you get pretty close. It's almost like Israel's Camelot. You see, there's a brief period of time where it was working. And that zenith we'll see in chapter 10. But so it describes his provision for one day, and it gives details about his 40,000 stalls of horses. So remember, for his chariots, 12,000 horsemen. So he did multiply. Now God did tell him, "I'm going to give you these things, but because your heart wants the best things." But even so, God well knew that if he gives the secondary gifts in too much abundance, what will happen is that it'll seduce his heart, and after a while, it'll carry him away from the fidelity to God, because it's our hard wiring is always to pursue the visible over the invisible, isn't it? The seen over the unseen. We're wired that way. And you remember how I described how men want to count, they want to control, they want to compete, they want to compare, they want to quantify. We're wired that way. They don't like ambiguity, you see. Well, how do I quantify discipleship? How do I quantify spiritual growth, you see? Tough stuff to measure, isn't it? But that's why the edifice complex can grip us so much. You know, the edifice complex? Building great buildings and so forth. And after a while, if we're not careful, attendance, buildings, and cash define us. We've talked about this again before. If you're defined by nickels and noses, by buildings, budgets, and body counts for 3 Bs, you see, people, they really are stupid enough to think that those are the metrics of the kingdom of God. He'd have to be a dimwit to believe that he'd be impressed by our numbers. Because your true impact is hidden, and it's not a question of quantity, because the divine equalizer has always been faithfulness to opportunity. That equalizes. Because whether you have much or little by way of time, talent, or treasure, doesn't matter. It's what you did with it. So it's the equalizer. And when we see that, then, it's the small things. It's the widow's mite, which no one would have known about that if Jesus didn't make a point of it. You see, my point is that little thing would normally, think about how many of those were given anonymously. The greatest saints in the history of the church will be not celebrated in church history textbooks. The vast majority of the greatest saints, we don't know yet. But their lives, they live faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs, as the end of Middlemarch puts it. But God notes and marks so that their life is never wasted, and that everything that we do matters. So let's be less impressed with what impresses people. Let's be more impressed with what pleases God. Let me open it up for some Q&A.
You say the trust the Father, abide in the Son.
And walk by the Spirit, yes.
The word trust, walk, those are 2 concepts that abide.
Yeah, abide that's a beautiful image of the vine and the branch. And so in John 15, so the whole idea of abiding in the vine is, how do you abide in the vine? Well, if you're a branch, you're not the vine, you're a branch in the vine. That's an important thing to see, because the branch itself never creates life. What does it do? It receives life. So now immediately we begin to realize, stop doing things for Jesus and start allowing him to do things through you. It's not a semantic nuance. It's a big deal. Because when I stop trying to do things, how was that? Was that okay? Really, it falls short. It's only when he lives his life in you and through you. So how does a branch abide? It receives the vitality. And what does it do with the excess life? That's called his life and the life of the vine. Where does it go? Where does that life end? It ends at the end of often the end of the branch, if it's a fruit-bearing tree. What do you have? You have what's called excess life. Fruit is abundant life. That you have life and have it abundantly, that you bear fruit, more fruit, and much fruit. And by bearing fruit, you will so prove to be my disciples. And this is how my Father is glorified. So the concept then of bearing fruit, and we know we've said this before, that the key to fruit bearing is really to abide in the vine. The key to abiding is obedience. So obedience is to abide. Do what he calls you to do, and you will walk in his life. So you're seeking to receive his life and let his life go through you as you. The fruit, the branch doesn't need. That's excess life. It has the seeds of its own reproduction, and it also nourishes. So it's evangelism and edification. But what you're doing, though, is you're receiving his life. What I love about this, though, is that you are a unique branch. And there's something about you that will uniquely display the life of Christ in a way, in this life, and also even more fully in the next, the way no one else can do. There won't be clones in heaven, which is a horrible thought, the idea of clones, you see. But instead, each person will uniquely display the life of Christ through the prism of their unique personality, but then perfected and after the judgment seat of Christ, made complete. So in this life then, I abide by obeying him. So when I say abide in Christ, I'm thinking about metaphors of walking with him, of receiving his life, of asking him to live in me and through me as me. And by the way, that's not something you do part of the time, is it? Again, abiding in Christ is supposed to be all the time. Walk by the Spirit is not just, I think I'll walk by the Spirit this morning. And maybe a little bit before I go to bed. You see, that's crazy. What does it tell us to do? Rejoice always. Pray without ceasing. In everything give thanks. This is God's will for you. We don't take that seriously. And set your mind on the things above, and so it goes. I'm saying that this is basic stuff for all believers, not Brother Lawrence. We always say, isn't that great, Brother Lawrence? Wasn't that one illustration? Well, for him, the chapel and the kitchen were like one. Nonsense. You can do the same thing yourself. You can glorify God when you're cutting a deal. You can glorify God when you're working with a vendor. You can glorify God when you're having even a dispute. You see? Yes?
Yeah, Ken, what lesson are we supposed to learn from that scene about Solomon dividing the babies? Other than dividing babies is not a good thing.
Yeah. Well, the lesson was that it would reveal who the real mother was. It was a risk that he was willing to take. He would have stopped the sword from coming down, but he was so confident that the real mother would protect the child. That was the wisdom that he anticipated, and indeed it would happen, and immediately he'd know even though there was not another witness. So the brilliance of that decision was a very risky and very dramatic thing indeed, and that's a wonderful example why people would come, and that's why the Queen of Sheba would leave by saying, "You exceed in wisdom." When does the rumor exceed the reality exceed the rumor? Pretty impressive, yes.
Can you explain to us a little bit about the pruning that God does?
Here. So he takes away, and every branch he has to prune. And sometimes he's going to prune good what appears to be good wood. When we have our roses pruned, I don't like to look at it because it's pruning way beyond what I want to do, because there are good branches in there that are cut off as well. But if you do not do so, at the end, you will not bear as much fruit. So he has to cut back. It is again, and I'll stop with this idea. I'm picking up on your body signal. But I'm picking up on this. That pruning, that suffering, will be confirmation, baptism, and purification. You need it. You're shaped by suffering. You need to be pruned. And so you bear much fruit, more fruit because of that pain and that adversity, you see. And you bear the peaceful fruit of righteousness, to use the Hebrews 12 metaphor of this. So I'm hoping this was helpful, at least to get a perspective of power, wealth, all the things that men look for. It's woefully inadequate compared to the fruit of the Spirit. Compare the two and you know I'm right. Love, joy, and peace you should take every time over money, sex, and power. You'd be a fool to take that which is passing away when you could pursue that which is going to last forever.